This is our historic moment of crisis and challenge, and unity is the path forward.
Well, our nation will always be divided. Our framers built it that way to keep it in check. And there will always be tension and arguments. Our founding fathers counted on it to fuel fervent debate. What we've lost is empathy and a sense of civility, and we can see where that leads through our history. Our nation's third vice president did shoot and kill our first Secretary of the Treasury. Fast forward 50 years, when they said a senator got beaten in Congress, they meant beaten in Congress. There never was a golden age of empathy and civility in American politics. And our horrific eras of slavery and forced relocation and war over states' rights to keep slavery and segregation show the slippery slope of where that can ultimately lead. But through the years, we habilitated our souls, and as we progressed through what we call the American century, we figured out how to disagree without being disagreeable. And to get back to that point, we need to remember when it occurred and why it worked and how it slipped away.
And Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful you have permitted me in the past, and I hope in the future, that singular honor, the honor of calling you my friend.
The age of respect and relative civility peaked in the 1980s with President Ronald Reagan and House Speaker Tip O'Neill. They disagreed and had spirited arguments, but they remained good friends, and they worked together, and they saved Social Security along the way.
Social Security was within 6 months of going bankrupt. Two old Irishmen, one named Ronald Reagan and another one named Tip O'Neill, they decided that they were going to solve this problem. And that was one of the stellar examples of government in crisis coming together in a bipartisan way.
Well, back then, Republicans had a big moderate and liberal wing in the Northeast and in California, while Democrats had a big conservative wing in the South that helped balance the parties and moderated our politics. But the balance first began to wobble as the parties developed a gender gap. Republicans embraced policies that attracted more men, and Democrats embraced policies that attracted more women. Then the country was rocked by President Clinton's sex scandal and impeachment, and then President George W. Bush's unpopular war in Iraq. Both parties lost one of their wings and pulled harder to the right and harder to the left. And as that happened, each party began to dominate different regions of the country, which gave them more power to draw their state's election maps and manipulate congressional districts to their advantage.
What has changed over the years is the gerrymandering of congressional districts so that you have a predetermined outcome before the November election. You know who's going to win.
Well, that actually goes back more than 200 years to a man named Elbridge Gerry. To reward his party, he signed a law to redraw the political districts of Massachusetts. And one of those districts was so rigged and squirmy the critics said it looked like a salamander and mockingly called it a gerrymander. And the pronunciation later morphed into gerrymander. It came to describe the way politicians stack their districts with voters from one party or the other to keep their districts safe. And both parties have escalated the gerrymandering of districts the past 20 years as we polarized as a nation. Here's former Republican Congressman David Jolly, who now has no party affiliation, on how polarization accelerated gerrymandering, which accelerates the polarization and hostility in politics.
It is in part because we have a closed primary system and we have gerrymandered districts to protect incumbents on Republican and Democratic sides, which for 20 years has led Republicans and Democrats to realize their path to getting reelected is to cater only to their base and to speak down to the other side, because otherwise they'll be primaried for not being a good enough Republican or Democrat.
And on top of all of that, 11 years ago, the Supreme Court opened the floodgates to big money special interests that spend unlimited cash smearing one side or the other. And as big money got more of a chokehold on political races, the federal lawmakers spent more time raising money and less time getting to know one another in Washington, which created distance and dysfunction.
Dysfunctional. Dishonest.
Inept.
Well, frustrated voters tried to correct that by throwing the rascals out, but they wound up pushing out the experienced deal makers who knew how to compromise with firebrands who knew what to say to get on TV and raise money.
We will not compromise.
The art of compromise and even the meaning of the word bipartisanship was lost.
Bipartisanship means they have to come our way.
Moderate, which by definition means keeping reasonable limits, became a dirty word in politics.
Dewhurst has served as a moderate Republican.
Which brings us to the man who beat Dewhurst by attacking him for being a moderate.
You're lying.
Once again, Lion Ted!
And of course, that brings us to the recent years of politics turning into a spectacle of insults.
You look like a fish monster, and you're a terrible person!
Lion Ted, Lion Ted.
I heard Lion Ted was going to be here, so we had to come represent.
That social media and opinion shows and traditional news media feed into because politicians have learned that talking trash gets them far more attention than talking substance.
Have you seen his hands? They're like this. When I was doing that, all these networks would cut in live. And you know what they say about men with small hands? That sort of conflict drives more ratings. People have figured that out, and that's how they get on television. Politicians get that. They recognize that I want to be on the news, I need to say outrageous things, and so it feeds into it.
Do you regret those insults back and forth, the tit for tat?
Yeah, and I said it at the time because it's not who I am, it's not why I ran.
And of course we know what happened next with a flood of false conspiracy theories and violence because we're still living through it. We just worked through the flashpoint to the last 40 years to show you how finding our way back won't be easy and it won't be quick, but at least we have a roadmap. And we have growing calls from the president and both sides in Washington to turn down the heat and a model and how we can both disagree and unite when we add empathy and civility to money, power, and politics.